The 7 nations of Canaan. We know them by name, but we rarely ask what they actually did. The Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. 7 nations listed in Deuteronomy 7 marked for destruction before Israel ever crossed the Jordan. Scripture calls them mighty, greater and stronger than Israel. Yet God commanded their removal, not as conquest for land alone, but as judgment for something far darker. These weren't just rival tribes. Leviticus 18 reveals the practices that defined them: child sacrifice to Molech, ritual prostitution, and abomination so severe that Scripture says the land itself vomited out its inhabitants. Archaeological evidence from Canaanite temple sites confirms what the Bible described: altars stained with the ashes of children, fertility cults woven into civic religion, and a society where the most vulnerable were fuel for the gods. For centuries, scholars softened this narrative. They called it exaggeration, propaganda to justify conquest. But the text never hides the reason. Deuteronomy 9:4 makes it explicit. Do not say in your heart, "It is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land," but it is because of the wickedness of these nations. It wasn't about Israel's goodness. It was about Canaan's collapse under the weight of its own corruption. When a society sacrifices its children for prosperity, it has already ended. The 7 nations didn't fall to Israel. They fell to the logic of their own worship. Israel was simply the instrument of a judgment already written into the fabric of their culture. The Assyrian Empire. They called themselves the sword of the gods. History called them the terror of the ancient world. The Assyrian Empire didn't just conquer, it erased. When they took the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC, they didn't occupy the land. They deported the population, scattered them across the empire, and replaced them with foreign peoples. The 10 tribes of Israel vanished, not defeated, dissolved. This was the Assyrian method, total cultural annihilation, and for a time it worked. Their empire stretched from Egypt to Persia, built on fear, brutality, and the belief that power was the only god worth serving. But 2 Kings 17 doesn't credit Assyria's strength. It credits Israel's sin. The people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God. They followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them. Assyria wasn't the cause of the collapse, it was the consequence. A nation that worshipped power was conquered by a nation that perfected it. And yet Assyria's own end came swiftly. Within a century, Babylon and the Medes razed Nineveh to ash. The empire that believed in endless dominance lasted less than 300 years. Nahum 3:7 recorded its epitaph before it fell. Nineveh is laid waste. Who will grieve for her? No one did. Power that feeds on fear starves when fear is no longer enough. Assyria devoured nations. Then it devoured itself. What do you think? Put it in the comments below. The Babylonian Empire. They built the tallest towers. They wrote the longest kings' lists, and they brought Jerusalem to its knees. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's armies broke through the walls of Jerusalem, burned the temple Solomon had built, and carried Judah's elite into exile. The Davidic king was deposed. The priesthood was interrupted. The sacrifices ceased. And Babylon celebrated. They had conquered the unconquerable, or so they thought. But Jeremiah had warned them for decades, not because Babylon was stronger, but because Judah had abandoned the covenant. Jeremiah 25:9. I will send for all the tribes of the north, declares the Lord, and for Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant. Babylon wasn't the victor, it was the tool. A hammer in the hand of a God bringing discipline to a people who would not listen. Babylon's greatness was borrowed. Within 70 years, Persia conquered the empire in a single night. Daniel 5 records the moment. A hand writing on the wall and a king trembling at words he couldn't read. Mene, tekel, parson. Numbered, weighed, divided, finished. The empire that thought it owned the world discovered it had only been renting, and the lease had expired. The Philistines. They gave their name to the land, but they were never meant to stay. The Philistines weren't native to Canaan. They arrived by sea, part of a larger migration during the Bronze Age collapse, and settled along the coastal plain. 5 cities, 5 lords, and a military technology that gave them dominance over Israel for generations. Judges and 1 Samuel paint them as the constant thorn, the uncircumcised enemy that humiliated Israel again and again. They captured the Ark of the Covenant. They gouged out Samson's eyes. They drove Israel to demand a king just to compete. But the Philistines weren't just warriors. They were assimilators. They adopted Canaanite gods, Canaanite names, and Canaanite practices. Dagon, their chief deity, was a god of grain, borrowed, not original. Their strength was in their weapons, not their worship. And when David killed Goliath with a stone and a sling, the message was clear. Superior technology means nothing when the foundation is hollow. By the time Babylon rose, the Philistines were a footnote. Jeremiah 47 records their prophesied destruction, and archaeology confirms it. Their cities burned, their culture absorbed, their identity lost. They lasted longer than Canaan's 7 nations, but not by much. A people defined by what they took could never hold what they had. And so they faded, remembered only by the name they left on someone else's land. The Amalekites. God said, blot out their memory. And he meant it. The Amalekites attacked Israel in the wilderness, striking the weak, the elderly, the stragglers at the back of the column. Deuteronomy 25:18 records it plainly. They met you on the way and cut off all who were lagging behind. They did not fear God. It wasn't war, it was cruelty for its own sake. And God's response was absolute. Blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Not defeat them, erase them. Generations later, King Saul was commanded to carry out that judgment. But Saul hesitated. He spared the king. He kept the best of the sheep, and in doing so, he lost his own kingdom. Samuel's words still echo. To obey is better than sacrifice. Mercy toward Amalek was disobedience toward God. Centuries later, Haman the Agagite, a descendant of Amalek's royal line, nearly succeeded in annihilating the Jewish people. The book of Esther reveals how close it came. One decree away from extinction. But the tables turned, and the Amalekites' final remnant perished in the very plot they had designed. A nation that made cruelty its identity, found that cruelty has no future, only an end. The Moabites and Ammonites, born from compromise, defined by hostility, ended in silence. Moab and Ammon shared a dark origin. The sons of Lot's daughters conceived in a cave after the destruction of Sodom. Genesis 19 doesn't hide the shame of it. From the beginning, these nations were marked by what they came from. And their relationship with Israel reflected that. They refused passage during the Exodus. They hired Balaam to curse Israel. They led Israel into idolatry at Peor, where 24,000 died in a plague. Deuteronomy 23:3 codified the judgment. No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. It wasn't ethnic hatred, it was consequence. They had chosen enmity over kinship, hostility over peace. And yet, Ruth was a Moabite. She entered the line of David, the line of Christ. Grace interrupted the curse, but not for the nations, only for those who chose differently. By the time Babylon rose, both nations were absorbed. Ezekiel 25 records their prophesied end. I will give Moab along with the Ammonites to the people of the east as a possession. They cease to exist as distinct peoples. No remnant, no return. The nations that chose hostility as heritage left no heirs to remember them. The Sea Peoples. They came without warning, and when they left, entire civilizations were gone. Around 1200 BC, the Bronze Age world collapsed. The Hittite Empire fell. Mycenaean Greece burned. Egypt barely survived. And at the center of the chaos were the Sea Peoples, a coalition of maritime raiders whose origins remain debated, but whose impact is undeniable. Egyptian records describe them as invaders from the north, attacking by land and sea. The Philistines were part of this wave, settling in Canaan after Egypt repelled them. The Bible doesn't name them directly, but their shadow is everywhere. The late Bronze Age collapse created the power vacuum that allowed Israel to settle the land. The great empires that had dominated Canaan for centuries were suddenly gone. Joshua's conquest happened not because Israel was mighty, but because the world around them had fractured. Some scholars suggest the Sea Peoples weren't just raiders. They were refugees, fleeing their own collapsing societies. Drought, famine, internal strife. They didn't destroy civilizations out of strength. They destroyed them out of desperation. And in doing so, they erased their own identity. We don't know their language. We don't know their gods. We only know the wreckage they left. A movement born in chaos could only produce more chaos. And when the dust settled, they had disappeared into the very collapse they caused. Israel and Judah themselves. And then there's the hardest truth of all. The people of God became the agents of their own collapse. Israel was chosen, called out of Egypt, given the law, promised the land. But Judges ends with a haunting refrain. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The kingdom split under Solomon's son. The north fell to Assyria, the south fell to Babylon. And every prophet from Isaiah to Malachi asked the same question, why? The answer was never external. It was always internal. Idolatry, injustice, pride. 2 Kings 17 catalogues the sins that brought down the northern kingdom. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them. The very practices God had judged in Canaan, Israel adopted. They became what they were supposed to replace. And Judah watched it happen, then did the same thing. Jeremiah wept over Jerusalem, but his tears couldn't stop the siege. Ezekiel saw visions of God's glory leaving the temple, step by step, threshold by threshold, until the presence that had filled the Holy of Holies was gone, not driven out. It left, because the people had already left first. But exile wasn't the end. 70 years later, a remnant returned. The temple was rebuilt. The story continued. Because collapse for the people of God was never meant to be final. It was meant to be refining. Even in judgment, there was still a covenant. And the covenant held when everything else fell. History is full of empires that believed they were eternal. Nations that thought their power was proof of their righteousness. Civilizations that built towers to touch heaven and woke one morning to find the towers empty. The Bible doesn't flinch from this. It records collapse after collapse, not as tragedy alone, but as testimony. That power without justice fails. That wealth without worship crumbles. That even the people of God are not immune when they forget whose they are. And maybe that's the weight we're supposed to carry. Not fear, but sobriety. The understanding that every society stands on something, and when that foundation shifts, everything built on it comes down. If you like our content, consider subscribing. Or if there are topics that didn't make this list or subjects you want us to feature, leave them in the comments.